Today's lecture is focused obviously on warfare, technology, and the ways in which global society have shifted and have changed in relation to changes in warfare. What we're going to do for today is first explore a bit of how globalization has altered warfare, drawing on the three approaches to globalization that we use plus one. So we're actually going to do a fourth approach today as well. Two, consider whether and how technology and cultural understandings have altered our understanding of the moralities of armed conflict. Part of what's going on in a lot of discussions about globalization and warfare is this central elephant in the room around technology. And a lot of times, media treatments of this topic tend to be a little bit shallow, in the sense that they look at technology as this autonomous force that changes society and changes globalization and changes war. And what I'm going to suggest is that we can think about this a little bit more deeply and a little bit more seriously using some of the materials we're going to make use of in this unit. And number three, participate in an assignment on the topics of war, technology, and globalization. You'll have an assignment to complete that will help you sort of put together all the different pieces of the puzzle over here. So, to start off with a bit of an overview, how has globalization affected war? We have our state-level perspective, which we've been working on in the class as a whole. Basically, the organization of war and the organization of states are two stories that have a lot to do with each other, and that are actually connected to each other in complex ways. The idea of the state as a bordered power container with a monopoly on the use of legitimate force is not something that just happened overnight. And it's not something that's always been the case. And so looking at how these stories about the state and about war sort of connect together becomes quite important for our purposes. Number two, there's a political economy of conflict, which we're primarily going to be exploring by looking at private military companies, private military firms, arms trading, and a few other little things like this. And then number three, the relative explosion of technologies of perception, integration, and articulation, which I'll define, really radically changing the conduct of warfare right around the period of the 1991 Gulf War, leading to what's known as the revolution in military affairs, the rise of automated systems, and really changing the technology side, and of course having complex social consequences as well. Lastly, the growth of weaponized narratives really speaks to the cultural side. We have some material to read on this as well. So, starting with the state-level perspective, the rise and decline and eventual rise of mercenaries is what I call it. Long story short, Europe in the Middle Ages is almost like a perfect natural experiment for thinking about the organization and disorganization of the use of violence. You have multiple small territorial sovereigns and sovereignties, kingdoms, princely states, and so on and so forth, with ill-defined territorial boundaries who are constantly fighting each other. And what we see in the Middle Ages is the growth of all of these private companies, more colloquially known as mercenaries. And people would say things like, they were the devils incarnate, they would just, rain terror across big chunks of the landscape. Because, of course, mercenaries, when they get paid, can go out and do a job, but when they aren't getting paid, tend to be relatively unhappy people. And as a result, you see all sorts of horror stories coming out of the role of these private companies in European history. Charles Tilly develops this theory, of course, this is fairly recently. Charles Tilly is a scholar who develops this theory of state building, which looks at the demise of mercenaries and the rise of the state. And the short title of this is War Made the State and the State Made War. What this means is essentially that you have this cycle of state consolidation, conscription, taxation, administration, and eventually national identity that puts an end to the entire use of mercenaries, at least for a time. So, states want to consolidate because they want an exclusive claim on power. Monarchs and sovereigns don't want to be challenged by other people in their territory. They want themselves to be in charge. So, rather than relying on mercenaries and hired labor, they try to conscript the people who might be tempted to fight against them into something like a national military, putting them under orders and putting them in a structure where they can be watched and they can be deployed militarily. Of course, that takes money. And as a result, you need taxation and more sophisticated taxation systems. Collecting taxes requires administration and infrastructure. And this is actually going to be really important because, of course, you need to build the roads and build the canals and build eventually the railroads that let you get to people in order to know where they are and how much they can afford to pay in taxes. Bit by bit, this cycle changes the way that war occurs at the same time as it builds states. And this is really, really important. The entire dynamic that Tilly was trying to identify is not simply that people got tired of mercenaries and got rid of them. It's that what made it possible to marginalize and push mercenaries out of the picture of war was precisely this state-building dynamic. Then, by the 19th century, you have the emergence of quote-unquote total wars between centralized state-like entities. In other words, trained, regimented, organized armies in which mercenaries play a small to negligible role. By the 20th century, this becomes transformed into what I refer to sometimes as machine wars. In other words, wars where the organization, sorry about that, we'll go back to this in a second, where the organization of violence and the organization of authority really comes from individual states and their use of technology and economic development in pursuit of their aims. This is a quotation that really sort of emphasizes this relationship from Tilly's scholarship, and it reiterates some of the same points I was discussing before. Well, moving forward into the machine war era, and this is the era of the military-industrial complex in the States. Into World War II, we are spending a lot of money on scientific research and technology in the shape of the Manhattan Project, of course, very famously. That money and that research doesn't just go away once the war is over. Instead, we take those innovations from the military sphere and bring them into the universities and bring them into the private sector. This is the military-industrial complex, this kind of marriage between universities, private firms, and the military is going to dominate the tools and the norms and forms of arms development during the Cold War. Many of the things that occur from 1940s into the 1970s, the arms race, the space race, and all of the various forms of militarized technology really are driven by this complex dynamic between these three poles of the society. We're going to invest a lot in science and science and technology through public investment. We are going to develop the National Science Foundation, which actually comes from the US Navy. We are going to export military technology to our allies during the Cold War, generalizing the tools of the military-industrial complex on an increasingly global scale. This dynamic, what I call the military-industrial complex, is really going to go from like I said, the 30s, once the U.S. is pushing to develop new weapons technologies, up into the late 1960s, early 1970s. And then it's all going to start to change. So, what I call Shadow Company is actually, it's the name of a documentary, a Canadian documentary made some years ago chronicling the rise of private military firms in Iraq in 2002 to 2004, roughly. But the backstory here is that in the 1970s and 80s, third world independence struggles generate a lot of quote-unquote surplus soldiers. Soldiers whose side lost the independence struggles, but who don't really want to return to civilian life or don't have the skills to return to civilian life. And so initially they start bouncing around looking for conflicts to join. 1980, Zimbabwe becomes independent, and soldiers in Zimbabwe go to South Africa to fight for the apartheid government in South Africa. South Africa, 1994, Nelson Mandela is elected South Africa's president, and they go to form executive outcomes. The first of these PMCs, the first of these firms, that actually does the fighting for you. Fast forward 10 years, and there are PMCs of all sorts in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and then even going more recently, Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, relies on a whole series of private military corporations in order to prepare its military for what would ultimately become the August War of 2008. All of a sudden, you have this massive reorganization of military force through the market, and in a way that actually corresponds quite well to the core periphery, semi-periphery issues that we've been looking at in the course overall. So a quick breakdown of how this works. Basically, you have three types of private military firms. Support firms are non-lethal aid and assistance. Truth be told, those are actually not that recent. They've been around for quite a while. Military consultant firms are the ones that advise and train troops for military operations. The Republic of Georgia, under President Mikhail Saakashvili, actually hired MPRI in order to train Georgian troops eventually to fight the Russians, which was the same firm that the Republic of Croatia had hired many years before in order to fight Serb paramilitaries during the wars in the Balkans. Lastly, military provider firms, the names change regularly because they get involved in scandals, and so the firms break up and they reconsolidate under a new name. But they're the ones who actually go out and do the fighting for hire, actually carry out specific missions and specific operations with for hire paid soldiers who don't have an obvious connection to any one single country. And what many people have argued that we're seeing is this emergence of the concept of battle space. In other words, less and less of war is organized around the idea of a battlefield per se, a physical piece of land or terrain, and more are organized around a sort of broader space that includes political economic ties, that includes cultural perceptions of private military corporations, and that really goes beyond the classic conceptualization of a battlefield. What we have here is a map of who is selling arms and who buys them. And again, it's very often in semi-peripheral countries. It's very often in countries that occupy at least sometimes a semi-periphery, where private military firms, arms exporters, and all of these industries of war are really able to consolidate. So India's big push since about 2015, 2016 or so to become a big arms center and to become actually fairly central to the South Asian weapons trade is a really good example of this, because of course by some metrics India is a semi-peripheral country, and sort of using this as a way of becoming part of the core of the weapons trade is actually one of Narendra Modi's key foreign policy goals and objectives for his term in office. Likewise, other countries that you see heavily represented here, it's not an accident that they are where they are. These are countries very often that really are part of the semi-periphery and are embedded in the weapons trade in very complex ways as a perceived tool of economic mobility. Well, moving away from the political economic perspective, we then see a series of developments that get us thinking more and more about technology. Now, technology, of course, is always changing. It's not that the prior steps have not had technology. But I do want to introduce three tools for thinking about this: perception, integration, articulation. Perception refers to how a system apprehends, absorbs, and sees the world. So, for example, once upon a time, you have people flying planes over battle sites and sending audio signals back to a receiving station in order to organize a map of the battlefield. Since then, needless to say, the tools have gotten a lot more sophisticated, but these are perceptive tools. In other words, they're ways in which you can see the world more clearly. Integration involves memory. It involves smoothing out the data points to integrate the whole thing into a clear idea of what it is we're looking at and seeing. And articulation refers to output. It refers to the ability to actually then generate estimates, outcomes, or in some cases, actions. And this, of course, is where all of this becomes very controversial going forward. Now, like I said, this is not intrinsically new, and in fact, people have talked about air power and the ability to remotely target sites, generate maps of contested areas, and so forth for a really long time, as you see from this animation from World War One. But in relatively recent years, the importance of this, the types of technology involved, and the role that it's played have really become much more important. As early as the Vietnam War and throughout the Cold War, again, these are some USian examples, but they're actually quite globally relevant as well, really started to think of the battlefield increasingly as a certain kind of controlled video game-like space. Military planners, military personnel were increasingly referred to the battlefield as something that could be wired. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wired like a pinball machine. The top image, by the way, is taken from a political geographer, Derek Gregory's website, where he shared some of the images that he works on in relation to bombing campaigns, technology, and perception. Likewise, during the Cold War, we built the SAGE system, the Strategic Air and Ground Environment, with radar sites and sector boundaries, all designed to make the US continental space legible in the case of a Soviet missile attack in the context of the Cold War. During the Vietnam War, the technology really wasn't there for this. So, for example, the US military tried to put heat sensors on the ground in Vietnam to be able to create a digital map of the terrain. Didn't work so well, the technology didn't keep on going very well, animals disrupted it, and so on and so forth. But by 1991, during the first Gulf War, this is all going to change. During the first Gulf War, to make a very long, complicated story very short, 1991 comes, 1990, August 7th, 1990, Saddam Hussein in Iraq invades Kuwait, arguing that he needed to reclaim revenue that was lost during his alliance with the US during the Iran-Iraq War during the 1980s. The backstory isn't so important for us here, it's really more what happens next. The US is going to eventually deploy about 527,000 troops into the Middle East in order to push the Iraqi army out of Kuwait and back into Iraq. But in the build-up to the war by itself is very revealing. There's going to be a really big push by Kuwaitis, by the Kuwaiti royal family specifically, to work with PR firms, Hill and Knowlton, for example, in order to generate a narrative and a story about territory and the body, the rape of Kuwait and the killing of babies, many of the eyewitness accounts, that were brought before Congress and were brought before congressional committees turned out to have been fabricated. But then also, if you look at the image on the bottom left of your screen, the use of visual technology as a way of trying to advance the goals of warfare. President George H.W. Bush was very conscientious of not wanting ground troops to get proverbially bogged down in the theater of war. So the use of so-called smart bombs and the use of visual technologies was very central to how the war was pitched and described and in some ways fought. Now again, the technology didn't always keep up with the promises made on its behalf. And you see from this very, very grainy, low-definition black and white image over there, pilots were not always dealing with very, very high-definition technology. But the die had been cast. And this is really where we see this set of broader changes in warfare. On the one side about technology, and then on the other side very much more about the use of narrative in the context of conflict. So, long story short, the war will be authorized by UN Security Council Resolution 678. It will be driven by media to a never-before-seen extent, the use of PR firms, which we mentioned already before the US Congress and the British House of Commons. It will rely heavily on precision airstrikes, reversing the traditional role of ground and air forces and the traditional division of roles that ground and air forces typically have had. And it will lead to the implementation and the development of the revolution in military affairs. Like I said, and as you can see from the quotation on the slide as well, there were still lots of problems with the technology, and in fact, much of the damage done to Iraq in 1991 was done by so-called dumb bombs, in other words, carpet bombing, as opposed to the smart bombs and the visual technologies that were being talked about and advertised. But this is going to set off a really broader revolution in military affairs. The growth of network-centric warfare, electronic intelligence gathering, reliance on remote and intelligent systems, and related to outsourcing key military functions, so relating to the Part B section we just went over, is all going to be driven out of this context. Firms like Blackwater, which then become XE, which then become Academy, are going to really take a more and more prominent role in carrying out military operations, in intelligence gathering, and so on and so forth. And the danger here, and this is something I see a lot and it kind of bugs me, is of a certain kind of technological determinism, of seeing the technology as the agent of change, of seeing the technology as the thing that causes the change. Where in reality, obviously the technology is important, but it's really the technology in the context of A, state level changes, B, political economic changes, and then C, different kinds of tools of perception, articulation, and integration that tends to make the difference. Last but not least is the notion of weaponized narratives. And you have a reading on this. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But long story short, the idea is that the idea pertains to the ability to use narrative in order to marshal certain kinds of emotional responses and certain kinds, ultimately, of policy responses. We saw a version of that, pardon me, we saw a version of that a little bit earlier when we were talking about Hill and Knowlton, and we were talking about some of the ways in which discourse was mobilized to create a narrative about the war. A narrative about Kuwaitis being the victims of ferocious Iraqi soldiers. A narrative about a vulnerable country at the hands of a rapacious one. When in reality, things were quite different and things didn't really quite line up like that. Well, more recently, and obviously through the power of social media, we've seen something very different happen, which is the ongoing weaponization of stories and of narratives and of narrative understandings of conflict to suit specific interests and to suit specific goals. So this is some of the issues we're going to be looking at in this module, in this unit of the class. Here are a few sources in case anybody happens to be curious. You're welcome to dig into these, though of course they are not required readings. And I look forward to talking to you all next week.